Now, there's one thing that you need to know, and that is if you, when you're talking, you can stand at the console because you can hear the difference. You've got better. If you want to talk, if you want to move around, you can put one of these on. But otherwise, and especially because of the teleconferencing thing, it's actually better if you can stand.
Yeah, I'll probably stand right there so I can keep an eye on those things. Good.
What's Rose's plan?
Half an hour. And she'll go first.
Yeah. I won't take it properly.
I'll give them, I won't give you 5 minutes time.
Oh no, please do, because I have a point. Oh no, give me 5 minutes, because I could just go. I haven't prepared it, but
Perfect. And I've put Rose to stand here. These are two separate classes, whatever. Alright, so. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to one of our last working sessions, and some of the best things are last. We've got 2 papers this afternoon, not 3. Apologies from Daniel Bolger. He had some problems with his own computer setup and other complications, so his apologies. He's not able to be with us this afternoon. But I'd like to welcome Dr. Rose Melville and Dr. Peter Chen, and they'll be looking at the way we use the net. And Dr. Melville from the University of Queensland is interested in some of the ethical questions that arise when we use the net for research purposes. And Dr. Chen will be looking at the way that the net can be used as a political association, and to what extent it mirrors screen-to-screen associations, as it were, mirrors face-to-face association in the extent to which it socialises people and mobilises them. So they're his questions. But first, over to Rose and using the net for research.
Thank you very much. Everyone hear me okay? Great. I'd like to declare my subject position right at the beginning. I'm interested in this topic for 3 reasons. Firstly, as a researcher who's become much more aware of the potential of the internet to do research. Secondly, as someone who's been involved in very intensive online teaching at a regional university across 4 campuses, very diverse campuses, one 400 kilometres away from the main campus. So we were using technology in a particular way, and a lot of research went on with students around that. And thirdly, because I spent some time as a member and also the deputy chair of an institutional ethics committee. And one of the things that I noticed within the last 5 years is the large volume and increase in the number of applications of researchers who are interested in using online techniques such as surveys, websites, emails, and basically mining or harvesting the data that exists on the internet. And it raises all sorts of really interesting methodological issues, practical issues, philosophical, and of course moral and ethical issues. Sorry? Okay, I picked this particular picture and the quote that comes with it as a sample of some of the polarities and paradoxes about the internet that we all confront with. Both the picture and the story come from two news stories on the Reuters news website, one from Japan and one from Europe. This is a picture of a guy using the computer, and the Japanese, the main emphasis in the Japanese story was that the internet hasn't actually got the structural and technological capacity to facilitate e-commerce in the next decade or two, and that there's a lot of people over in Japan working to try and address that problem because it's a serious issue. The other thing is a completely different paradox, and that is that the major internet search engine mentioned there is Google, and it actually operates out of America. And Google announced quite recently that they've developed the capacity for what they call Gmail, which has 1 gigabyte of free storage capacity. But the proviso is if you sign up for this particular email service, you agree to be tracked, you agree to have all your data processed, and there's a whole lot of detail in this particular news story about what you agree to do. One of the paradoxes of that is that Google operates out of America, where privacy laws and protection of data are fairly lax, possibly as lax as Australia. I'm not sure if there's any lawyers in the audience, but they can correct me on that. But in Europe, the European Union have passed very, very stringent privacy laws. So getting access to potentially identifiable and personal data, which does actually come across the internet in terms of email discussion lists, whether it's public, private sorts of sites, is prohibited. And one of the warnings that, one of the things I note in my paper is that researchers, particularly when you're using the internet across jurisdictional boundaries, need to be aware of the fact that legally there are very, very different parameters around what you actually can do with data and how you need to protect it. So I just thought that was an illustration of some of the themes that I've developed in my paper. Well, let's look quickly, methodologically, at some of the advantages of online research. What's often referred to, or, the sort of pundits who sort of say that this is the greatest thing since sliced bread was invented, is that the internet gives us the potential to get a lot more participants that aren't accessible in conventional research. And we can think of some sort of particular groups, such as groups with disabilities, groups with particular illnesses that go to the net for alternative sources of medical information, youth, minority groups, etc. One of the other things that's mentioned is, and this is where researchers often say that it's actually a bit of a cutting-edge sword, is that there's an assumption that it's reduced time and cost. You just type up your survey, you email it out to people, they email it back, you get the appropriate software, you dump it into that, and you analyse it. You don't have to sort of go through the whole paper process and the way you normally recruit and get informed consent and that sort of thing. So that online surveys are much easier. Going to pre-existing data pools like multi-user domains and moos, as well as public listservs and, discussion lists, that sort of thing, bulletin boards, chats, conference rooms. There's this huge existing pool of data. And one of the other things that researchers comment on is it increases participant motivation because it's less time and effort for them. They don't have to leave their house, they don't have to go to a focus group, they can do the focus group online, etc., etc. And what a lot of people also comment on is it's very easy to use both quantitative and qualitative methods online. One of the assumptions is that quantitatively that methodology is easier online, but a number of researchers, including Mann and Stewart, have written in depth about the way in which you can use qualitative methods online quite successfully. Now, what are some of the limitations and problems? These have already been referred to, but we've got the problem of bogus data and participants. And it's something that people in the conference haven't referred to much yet, but a lot of people create multiple identities, and there's a syndrome known as the typist keyboard syndrome, where we don't know who's actually at the keyboard at any particular point in time. And obviously, because we still don't know any definite figures about who's using the internet, there's a problem of skewing samples and unequal access to the internet around the world. And one of the problems for those online participants and novice researchers in the online medium is that there's different levels of computer skills and also different types of software problems in terms of adapting them and using them for internet research. And of course, the thing I'm most concerned about is ethical and moral dilemmas relating to it. So why are ethics important to internet research? They're just as important as for face-to-face research. But one of the reasons is it's a new medium. Most of the regulatory bodies and thinking, both from the research community, the grant community and from government, haven't actually caught up with developing any ethical guidelines. Most of you who've gone through grants, either through the ARC, NHMRC, consultancies, etc., will have possibly used the Institutional Ethics Committee process. And from my experience as someone who's on that body, most people see it as an obstruction and an annoyance, and that we deliberately frustrate people's research, whereas in actual fact our committee operated to try and facilitate and maximise people getting through all those hoops. But at the moment there's very few ethical guidelines. Now, it's not only researchers, but computer programmers. Bolger talks about this quite a lot. Computer programmers are concerned about some of the very unethical research that's already been done on the internet, and there's interesting case studies I can refer people to if you're interested in following up on this topic that aren't specifically described in my paper. But both King and Bolger say that we have a risk of alienating the public in the same way that we do using other sorts of research techniques face-to-face. And as a result, we have a problem of discrediting ourselves, and there's a flow-on effect for other researchers. So there's a very interesting example in the literature by an Australian woman called Elizabeth Reed, who got involved in an MUD, a multi-user domain dungeon game. And as a result of her research interactions in that, completely fragmented, not deliberately, relationships in that, and I was very honest in reflecting on what had happened and why it had happened. And she's now one of the advocates for cautioning people about thinking more carefully before you get into designing your study, thinking about the ethical implications first and incorporating that into the whole design, rather than we usually get a great idea and then we want to know how to implement it. But ethics, from my perspective, should be thought of when you're thinking of your research question. I mean, it's just such an important thing to do. One of the other things I talk about a lot in my paper in more detail is not only is a new medium, but the public-private distinction is not clearly delineated. And I'll come back to that. The other problem that we have in trying to decide what sort of ethical framework researchers should operate in online is that people are coming from different disciplinary and theoretical paradigms and boundaries, and they view the online medium in different ways, and I'm going to come back to that. One of the questions that I came up with in my paper was, do we need a separate code? Or do the existing ethical frameworks that we have suffice? I'm still trying to work that through. I suspect we need an appendage to existing ethical guidelines, because at the moment a lot of arts and humanities and social science ethics still operates under the NHMRC guidelines, which are still very medical orientated, even though the national statement's been expanded and it's currently being revised by ARHEC, the Australian Ethics Committee. But at the moment there's no separate ethical codes in Australia. We work under the existing NHMRC guidelines. But for those of you who are interested in following this up, a chap called Charles S., E-double-S, it's on the internet. He convened in the late 1990s, early 2000, a group of internet researchers. They formed the Association of Internet Researchers, and they've produced a document looking at a whole lot of ethical issues for researchers online across jurisdictions and countries. And their findings, both theoretically and practically, are online. You can download those. And the other interesting thing is that in Bofield's work, you can actually find computer programmers and computer professionals' statement on ethical conduct of research, because they're concerned about researchers getting access to existing data, because they know what can be done with that data and how easy it is to find it. Now, I thought I'd just mention a couple of these things, because I know that I'm so imbued with all this ethical stuff because I've been working in this field. But a lot of people, unless you've put in an application, don't really understand how it's all assessed and worked around, like what emphasis people put on bits and pieces. In the Australian context, under the National Statement, the four main ethical principles are maintaining confidentiality, obtaining voluntary and informed consent, making sure research has some beneficence or social justice, and making sure that the burden and benefit doesn't outweigh, for the participant, the research. So if it's going to be more burdensome for the participant, you have to justify that. Now, implicit in the Australian guidelines is a belief in the integrity and respect for human research participants that has been added in from the American core 3 principles. We've got 4. And this states that our respect for human subjects must take precedence over the quest for knowledge, and this is where I hope Peter and I can have a stoush. I was forming this opinion as a younger academic and a researcher prior to getting involved with ethics, but I now firmly believe from some of the research projects that have come before me, and I've discussed informally with colleagues in my role, as well as independently, some research should never take place. And I say that absolutely strongly, despite the curiosity and the needs of the researcher. Some of it is pure voyeurism. It potentially can be damaging psychologically and physically for people who are the research subjects. Now, there's a lot of pressure on us, as we know, with the change in the higher education sector and in funding, etc., to do more research. And some of the practical things that we obviously all think about when we're thinking through the ethical process is how do we recruit our participants? Well, online they exist. We can go to the email discussion list, we can ask the moderator for permission, we can send out a generic email and we can ask all of the participants whether or not they want to be involved, or we can lurk and we can not tell anyone like Norman Denzin decided to do. In terms of gaining consent, as I said, we can ask people or we can decide to use a form of what's called negative consent. Obviously, in terms of confidentiality, not only of people and their data, and accessing existing data and the responsibilities of researchers. One other issue that cuts right across this, that was also developing and became a concern for people involved in ethics, is privacy. And privacy in internet research is really becoming a major concern. Our community standards are changing and the laws are constantly changing to challenge the invasion of privacy through new technologies. The EU, the European Union codes of privacy are the most stringent in the world, and that's the reference for anyone who wants to look up Charles Esser's work. The Australian privacy laws, from all of the literature I've been able to find, are much more lax. One of the issues with the EU is that there can be no identifiers at all on any data, any personal data that's used by researchers. Now, for someone who's involved in an ethics perspective, some of this is a little bit repetitive, but you can see some of the major themes that are coming through, so I'll just quickly go through these. The risk assessment is obviously really important in terms of what potential danger or burden you can expose people to. The main groups that obviously ethics committees are concerned about are so-called vulnerable and dependent groups, but that also includes over and under research groups. So people are particularly concerned about the over-research of prisoners. Prisoners became the flavour of the month in New South Wales a couple of years ago, and fortunately the institution, the bureaucracy put in very stringent criteria to actually stop people going off and doing all this amazingly bizarre research with some of the prisoners. And also the issue of deception. Prior to the development of ethical codes after the war and in Australia in the 60s and 70s, we followed the rest of the world, America, etc. It's quite common in both medical and social science research to use some form of deception. We're all familiar with different sorts of participation observation studies where people went off and studied communities and didn't tell them they were a researcher, etc., etc. Now, deception is not considered a default position. You have to justify methodologically the intrinsic worth of using deception as a method, and I actually think that's a really, really good thing. There's all sorts of interesting anecdotes I can throw into the conversation about the pros and cons of that. And also, obviously, cultural sensitivity is important, and with the internet, for those of you who were in this theatre, I think, earlier on yesterday, there was an amazing presentation from a chap involved in the computer side of academia, and he had all these codes up on the wall, and you can track everybody, you can track any piece of information, and it has been done. It's been done while researchers have been puddling in various sorts of internet environments, and people have actually been physically assaulted and found and located. Their addresses have been found, and it's not just abuse and flaming and raging that occurs in those forums, but it actually can be a physical danger to people when you can find out where they are. And of course, reporting and publishing your results. How much time have I got? Okay, great. Privacy research in Australia. We haven't, from what I could find, we haven't actually got a lot of research on that. There's some studies that have been done by the Australian Privacy Commissioner, and this is actually very interesting. It shows that a high proportion of Australians are concerned about privacy issues, and there's two things they're concerned about. First is the proliferation of new data gathering and processing technologies, and particularly surveillance. I know my students are not an atypical group at all, but it's interesting in one of our classes last year how they had gone to the internet and they had found all sorts of information out about the new eye scanning processes and the prediction of when they would come in and they'd be common use and that sort of thing. And the other thing that people are very, very concerned about is the amount of data that they don't know about, that is kept about them by numerous agencies who do not seek any permission to use it. And they sell it, as you know, there's commercial. Fairfax and Murdoch have subsidiary companies that sell this sort of data to people. Now, two major themes came up, well, a large number of themes came up in the literature, but in my paper I focus on two. And this shows the paradox of how researchers have approached research. The construction of what I call cyber participants. And secondly, the internet and the public-private divide. One of the debates that goes on in the literature is, are cyber participants people, or are they just the object at the end of a keyboard and they're disembodied, and what actually happens in the keyboard, they're sort of disembodied from the technology, or are they human subjects and they're actually just acting upon and working on with the computer or the technology? And these two competing discourses come out quite clearly in the approach of social scientists and the humanities. And the theoretical analyses that underpin the two different discourses situate cyber participants and their data in very different ways. And as a result of that, it leads on to how they view ethical issues to do with research. So I'll go through the social science and then the humanities view. In the social science view, human subjects and people who play with the internet in all sorts of different ways and forums are positioned as human subjects. And it fits in very much with a very liberal notion of the autonomous individual. And this is important because in terms of the sort of ethics discourse, it's about seeking permission, getting consent, being informed, knowing what the study is about, what your expectations are, what you'll get out of it, what might happen to you, all those sorts of things, before you use their data. And they have the agency or the capacity, the autonomy, the ability of making those informed decisions. And we know now with research with children, really, really young children, we used to have theories about young children developing moral concepts at about 8, but we know that we can do research projects with children younger than that who actually can make informed decisions about whether they want to be involved in research at educational facilities like primary school as young as 5 and 6. And they can give their consent. Obviously, CMC's generated data, according to the proponents of the social science view, is an outcome of an ongoing social forms of interaction. So they don't see the technology as the driver. They see the people involved with the technology are playing and working with the technology, and that the data is not merely textual forms of communication. They also warn about the tendency to objectify online participants because they don't really exist in time and space. And I can go into that in more detail in question time. So as human subjects, they should be viewed in the same way as those viewed in face-to-face sorts of environments. I don't particularly agree with that completely. I think that the internet does pose different sorts of scenarios about how to approach the whole ethical situation. But I just want to show the contrast. And obviously this has flow-on effects for how you go about getting consent and maintaining confidentiality. Now the humanities view, and I realise I'm being very generalist here, the internet is conceived in a very different way. It's a site of textual production and the creation of wide forms of mediums. Data is viewed as text, art, images, language, which is created by disembodied subjects and often multiple identities and multiple subjects. And as a consequence, these subjects have authorial control over their medium and copyright, and they often claim that. They're not ascribed with human or social qualities, and therefore, according to some researchers, they don't need to give their permission to use the data because it's already in the public arena. It's covered by copyright and it's covered by those sorts of issues. So a researcher is not obligated to maintain confidentiality or disguise the identity of the author or creator, because in the case of some of those art, text, mediums, images, social protests, political protests, they put them up on the web for people to find them. They're making a statement. So that's one of the reasons why people say it's in a public space, therefore it's public data, just as the ABS data is, etc. And authors do not expect privacy or ethical regulation of their work. Why should they? The other one, which I find theoretically and practically very interesting, is this whole notion of public-private divide and the internet. Material on the internet is publicly accessible to anyone, including researchers, by virtue of the nature of the medium. Unless it's a closed list and you're able to manipulate your way somehow onto it, a lot of the things on the internet are fairly easy to find and access. According to some researchers, what we should view the internet is as a metaphor and as another public space. It's just like a park, an open-air concert, a sports arena or the street. Now, when we're all out there having lunch, some people were lurking around the coffee cafe area, and we all could have been doing some participant observation on each other. And so some people say, well, the internet is this great big arena that's like another public space. Given it's a public space, as I said, except for closed lists, closed MUDs and MOOs, etc., consent and confidentiality is not required to use data. And my question is it public or is it private? And I didn't resolve that issue in my paper. I've left it open. I think it's an ongoing conversation that researchers need to have. King, he takes a very clear position on one side of the continuum. He argues that it's not simply a private or a public space, and I think I agree with that position substantially. But internet users have very different perceptions. When you look at some of the research that's been done, whether it's on fairly benign topics or fairly sensitive issues, you'll find that internet users themselves, and the feedback they've given researchers, is that what they may perceive as public is actually to them a private space. And that there was a lot of trust and there was a lot of confidentiality that they felt the other users had given by being in that space, and that the researcher violated that. So internet users' perceptions about what's public and private complicate the issue, is what I'm saying, compared to what we think might be public or private. And not all the same internet users in an MUD or an email list will actually have the same opinion about that. When you get to the other end of the continuum of closed discussion lists, then quite often it's very private. An open discussion list, most people would agree that it's public and you can use that. You can quote things from it, etc. One of the reasons that people say that some of these terrains are seen very much as semi-private and safe spaces in which they can divulge quite personal, and they do, quite personal and public information, is that the very language that the technology uses, homepage, territory, map, all sorts of, images and metaphors that are used to sort of create some sense of privacy and some personal space. It's sort of like a protection from other people involved in the internet. And unfortunately, we probably have heard of a number of different stories. The most famous is one of a doctor, I think, who got on a women's online discussion list and discovered that he was able to form closer relationships and learn more about women by adopting a female persona called Joanna. And when the other people on the list discovered that he was actually a male and they disclosed all this personal information in Girl Talk, they were extremely outraged and very, very cranky. That's just one example of, he wasn't a researcher, but the public's tolerance and perceptions about privacy, etc. The other thing too is that lots of people have different levels of knowledge and sophistication about the internet. We're not all technos. I've used it a lot in teaching, but I certainly wouldn't say I was techno about it all. I certainly know how it interacts with my teaching, but there are a lot of people who aren't aware that a whole huge host of software can be used by fairly unsophisticated people. You can just go and buy it and get it free downloaded. You can trace people's postings, you can trace their activities, you can trace their addresses, you can trace their identities online. Some people are very clever at hiding their identities. So what some people are saying is the analogy of it being to a public park doesn't equate with people's personal experiences, because they leave trails of very identifying information behind. And in some examples in research, it has actually led to physical assault and harassment, as well as people losing their jobs, all of those sorts of things. So users have very different notions of their personal self-boundaries than has previously been assumed by a lot of internet researchers. One of the other things that you find, particularly with young people, it also happens with other groups, but particularly with young people, is that they have a perception that no one's behind the screen, and that they are disembodied, and that they can talk about what they really think and what they really feel. Their parents aren't around, authority figures aren't around. They'll disclose lots of really interesting information, and that's come up in suicide research, anorexia type research, a whole stack of stuff to do with that. And they feel that they won't be betrayed in disclosing that, because it's not like going to a focus group. If any of you have tried to work with a range of different sensitive topics, support groups, etc. in your research, you'll know that even with a group of like-minded people, it can be very difficult to draw that information out. On the internet, it's like, oh goodness, it's there, it's in the data, it's in the text. So they see it as a fairly safe environment and believe that they can maintain anonymity because they're not seen. I know that's simplistic, but I'm talking here about what we have learnt as experienced researchers and what are some of the issues. They think that the material can't be traced to their day-to-day experiences or their real-life identities. Now, some preliminary guidelines for ethics. King suggests that we have a think about a graduating scale from the public and private dilemma. The closer to the private end of the continuum, there's a need to get informed consent and maintain confidentiality. The further away we get, the less need to seek consent in terms of like usual participant observation. Anyone could have been out in the cafe area and been taking notes about us at lunchtime, etc. Some of the practical guidelines. Margaret Emerson's written a very interesting paper that's now been loaded up on the the Association of Internet Researchers website. And she says that researchers need to consider the specific genre of the site, who creates it, the purpose of it, etc., people's perceptions of privacy, the potential sources and degree of harm, what legal and ethical in terms of subcultural, not just legal in law, but ethical subcultural traditions have been built up amongst the participants. So if you go into a site where there's netiquette and ground rules, then working out what those ground rules are and negotiating with those are really important. That's aside from the general institutional ethical guidelines that you may or may not have to deal with. The baseline position is that consent should be obtained at all times if possible, even though it's often not practicable. This is where I probably get really shocked. And some of the ways people have dealt with this by getting consent at the very, very early stage of research by using key informants. Even at this conference where people have reported on some of the ways they've handled data from the internet, it's quite clear that people have gone to either the moderator or they've been online for a while, they've thought through some of the issues, they've disclosed whether they're doing research or not. Research design should be modified if consent is not given and whether people withdraw or it becomes inaccessible. I'll give you an example of one that was a very interesting project and probably would have been very useful in a policy way for people involved in road safety and road, trying to get message across to young people about road safety, etc. A postgrad student at the university, one of the universities I was at, wanted to actually look at memorial sites on the internet where people had specifically built a site to celebrate the life of a loved one. They wanted to be able to just approach the people because the site was hanging out there and ask them a series of questions. The ethics committee said, yes, well, they obviously have posted something up that's very public. They're making a statement, and they've decided, and they've actually, a lot of the people had said they'd deliberately done that instead of buying gravestones or having some other memorial. It was a whatever. The person came from a humanities discipline, so they saw it as an object. They saw it as a creation, a text, an image. That's how they were seeing it. The ethics committee had some deliberations about it and said, well, it's about a very sensitive topic across all cultures, just the whole topic of death and dying. So how do we go about approaching people to get their consent? And a number of sort of steps were put in process where, because most people had the email address on their website homepage, that the researcher had to send an email to the particular web email list, send an attachment of a consent form and an explanation sheet, and then ask if people were interested to contact the researcher via their email. And that was seen as a sort of safety net. Unfortunately for the particular postgrad student, once people realised that she wasn't interested in the site for the purpose she'd developed, they'd developed it for, she got no responses. She had to modify her research process. That was a very interesting process for all of us, obviously including the student, and it comes back to an earlier point I made, and that is some research should never be done, even though it tickles our fancy incredibly and may contribute to the wider knowledge in society. But then I have a different perspective on things. I'll just summarise pretty quickly now. Researchers should obviously, as a minimum, try and avoid the situation where participants end up feeling violated when we gain access to their data. And that can be music, images, photos, words, whatever. Users are not going to assume that people are accessing the sites for research purposes, just as we were out in the cafe area at lunchtime and we didn't assume there was anyone watching us. There could have been. And researchers should be able to defend the use of covert research, lurking online, which meets good privacy and ethical practice. One way, and in question time I can answer some more specific examples of practically how people have gone about trying to get informed consent. One way is actually to set up a specific site, a laboratory site, and that those of you who've taught online, been involved in setting things up in government, will know that there's a dedicated site there. You're able to actually put consent mechanisms and data process mechanisms in place because they're closed sites, and the researcher and user can have limited access to those. And I'll finish there, I think.
Thanks, Rose. A whole raft of interesting ethical issues, and I, for one, am very interested in getting into some of the stories, some of the case examples. Thanks. So now we move to Peter's research. Peter has used the internet as a research site to see how others use the internet for political purposes. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I I guess I'd say, by way of introduction, that when I... No. That when I... bloody computers. When I initially started doing this research, I didn't realise that I'd come to the conference and end up being a case study in Rose's paper, because Rose is going to gut me like a pig in about 10 minutes with regards to my base ethical approach to this subject. Essentially, and I'm taking the conference organisers' latitude of being entirely disorganised in my own paper, where I ask everyone else to have their papers prepared and speeches and presentations all written. I, of course, have these handwritten scribbles done at 2 a.m. Essentially, what I wanted to do with this paper and this research project, and now that I've listened to Rose, I'm glad it's not on the line yet. I can go back and scrub out a few things out of it, some names and things like that. But I've been reflecting for a number of years, and I'm only a new academic, so it's only been a very small number of years, about the way in which the internet and new media technologies are used for political purposes. And in the past, I've been interested in top-down approaches because I'm a classic kind of political scientist. So I started out and I said, let's talk to all the elected representatives of Australia and see what they do with new media. Okay? The top down. Let's see what they're doing, how they're responding, the classic kind of technological adoption stuff. Then I said, let's go and talk to all the local governments in Australia and see what they're doing with regards to new media and democracy and those sort of things. And just for a break, and because I have an interest in methodologies, I decided to undertake this small, and it is a small pilot study, of general political email lists and their use for kind of political purposes. And I'm not going to speak for a long time. That will limit my pain. But essentially, I was interested in email lists for a number of reasons. The first reason I was interested in email really is because, in a sense, email is the killer app politically on the web, and that's for a number of reasons. And the very first reason, it is the kind of web technology or internet technology that gets the most use. But also, and very importantly, and this does relate to what Rose has talked about, and I think I'll come back and reflect on that in a second, is that the interesting thing about email and the internet and democracy is email has the lowest kind of desktop technological requirements. If you're using advanced lists, if you're using archiving, if you're using moderation, that can all be done remotely. Whereas 3D virtual reality parliaments, interactive kind of amazing flash sites that pop up things require a large desktop environment. And so I was interested in email particularly as an internet sub-media form because of its kind of democratic nature by its nature. And it predates the internet. When I was a young person, as opposed to now, I used to be very interested in bulletin board systems, the old precursor kind of public networking approach. Email was the thing then, and that was local. This is global, so I'm interested there. The other thing, and coming from a political scientist's perspective, is that I was interested in not simply kind of temporary activities. I wasn't interested just in the deans. You know, how a dean comes along, he does something new, whoa, you know, wow, let's write kind of stuff about it. The Zapatistas, the Yugoslavian radio things. I wasn't just interested in the spikes, the interesting individual case studies. I wanted to look at things that had a degree of permanency, because I have an interest in time. Fundamentally, taking on the perspective of Paul Sabadia with regards to my policy studies, I'm interested in policy in terms of 10-year time blocks. Okay, and so a lot of the studies I think that have been done on politics and the internet, while they're interesting, are they trends? Are they blips? What are they? We don't know, and until we put them into a long-term context. And time is very important, and that's where I'm going to have a go at you in a second, Rose, if that's okay. You ready for it? All right. So I was interested in longitudinal kind of research. And finally, reading a lot of internet democracy literature, there's a lot of absolute crap out there, you know, about, you know, the internet as a new public sphere and, you know, that whole kind of, now that we've invented the internet, all war, all misunderstanding will be resolved, kind of high modernist sort of stuff. So I was interested in this kind of discussion about the internet as a public sphere and where is it kind of most likely to be discussed in terms of the public sphere, these internet discussion lists. So that's kind of the background there. I'm a bit of a punk, so I was just leading in with a kind of young punk's kind of view. Let's take a few people down. Theoretically, as opposed to kind of just in terms of the questions that I've encountered in recent years, I'm interested in four kind of things. And when I say theory, I'm using in that soft T, the small t theory word, because these aren't actually theories, are they? They're not causal constructions. Okay, they're kind of theoretical in the terms that they kind of come out of book learning and stuff like that. I was interested in political email lists with regards to four kind of features. Three very conventional, very traditional political science kind of concerns about places where politics happen. Political socialisation. How, as members of a society, as people with a will to power who want to express our political will, me win, you lose, I'm the boss kind of thing, how do we learn about politics, political institutions, the way in which we achieve our objectives? So political socialisation, first kind of thing. Secondly, obviously in terms of conventional understanding of political science, I was interested in political aggregation. How do we get people together in enough numbers to be effective in some way? And I'll come back to that in a second. And finally, I didn't simply want to go out and look at these areas in which people yada 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 about politics. People talk about politics all the time. I was interested in the mobilisation effects. How do people take discussions about political issues, institutions and causes, and how do they turn them into actual concrete outcomes? So obviously I have a somewhat Sartrean view about action, reality and things like that. Finally, being a kind of embedded within the current debates about political science, I'm obviously interested not just in technological networks, but also social and political networks. So I was interested in the way in which these sort of communities have elements of real communities, in terms of real with regards to physical kind of community elements, and I'll come back to that in a second. And essentially I took this kind of hypothesis approach to the paper. And it's not a real hypothesis, because hypothesis is usually something you kind of want to find out. But what I did was I said, in regards to the literature in political science about societies like Australia, but also the United States, Canada, the UK, Europe, it's all around, I wanted to see, does the internet provide something to overcome the deficit? And the deficit's always constructed, and it's down the bottom here, always constructed with regards to this decline in political interest and participation. And in Australia, we've had this kind of discussion for a long time, the decline of parties or the death of parties hypothesis. People in Australia never really were big joiners of political parties, we know that, but certainly the party numbers have remained relatively static for a long time, where our population has gone up. And the kind of political scientist response to this phenomena, being interested in institutions, political scientists are very big on institutional structures, is that obviously we're all becoming less politically active and aware and interested, and this is constructed as some sort of problem. It's a bad thing for democracy. And so my question was, well, does the internet, as it's often discussed, does it provide an alternative to traditional political structures? So instead of going out and joining a political party or getting active in a local interest group or cause-based group, are people going online to fulfil this deficit? Okay, and I know there's a huge kind of normative construction in the use of the word deficit there, I'm aware of that, but I use that as a working hypothesis to kind of get into the research. And I kind of, it's a wink and a nod to you to go, I'm not really serious about that, let's just run with it for a while and see what happens. And obviously it is a bit of a response to what Pippa Norris has often talked about with regards to partisan de-alignment. And what she says is, oh, well, really, partisan de-alignment is actually a generational life cycle effect. Young people are more interested in cause-based activism. They join Greenpeace, they boycott things, they don't join parties, but they get much more conservative and conventional as they get older. That's a classic kind of old person's theory, because it's basically unprovable. How do you know that this generation will become just as conservative and boring as the last generation? But boy, doesn't it sound nice, and it makes us all feel okay that young people aren't engaged politically in our traditional structures. So this is where I'm kind of heading at. So there are kind of normative and angry elements to my research here that make me young, firebrand. And so I'm really tired, so I have to kind of work myself up to a ladder because we come to stats, and it gets even less exciting. So, what was I going to do? Okay, so in terms of kind of approach then, I said, okay, let's take a pilot sample. So it is a pilot study, and it's got quite a few limitations that I think you'll all see really clearly very quickly in terms of my approach. But let's take a pilot study, 3, inverted commas, general political email lists, okay? And obviously you can drive a truck through that. What's a general political email list? But 3 general political email lists within Australia, 3 email lists that are open to the public, where people generally talk about political issues and debates. And I used 3 basic approaches: conventional content analysis, so coming from my very empirical background, creation of a coding frame, data elements, analysing the content of that, and Rose is rubbing your hands, oh, I'm going to gut this guy. Coding messages that travel along those lists, a little bit of observational style stuff, very covert, no informed consent, and I'll come back to that in a second. And then also, because I can see who responds to whom on email lists, social networking analysis using the UCI networking software, which we're all very familiar with. It's become a bit of a kind of desktop standard in the social sciences. Now, before Rose gets too warmed up, why am I taking this approach? The lists, archived as they are, give me longitudinal data, okay? And as a political scientist who understands that political change is not simply short-term construction, I need longitudinal data. And I can't go and get informed consent. And if I have to get informed consent, I can't do it. And we have a discussion about that, don't we? Coming up, Rose. So, let's talk about the 3 lists. And are you okay with this, Graham? Graham Young, sitting in the audience,
I was wondering.
The 3 lists are one called Australian Politics, and I've left the and yours sits on the MSN side, isn't it? Yeah. Your Yahoo. Oh, okay. One called Australian Politics, one called Online Opinions, which hangs off Graham Young's Online Opinion e-zine, and another one called Political Lobby. Now, they're very similar lists in a way in which they're kind of general open lists. Anyone can join them. They're archived quite publicly through readily accessible tool sets. But the differences is, and this is why I would do a 3 kind of case comparison, is the Australian Politics list on one side of the spectrum has no accoutrements. It is just a list. You go to the site, it just says, here's the list, join it and chat on the list. Online Opinions at totally the other end of the spectrum has a large, active e-zine attached to it, where it generates new content all the time. So it's got a very active kind of accoutrement. And Political Lobby sits in the centre. It's got stuff attached to it, but it's just a portal for other kind of content. Okay? Why these lists? Well, they're publicly accessible, they're archived, and I could go and do the content analysis over a reasonable period of time. There's some stats here, but you can see by and far Online Opinions is the most busy during the sampled periods, and it's a sample of about 3 years overall. Online Opinions had 96 active authors, okay? Whereas Political Lobby, on the other hand, had 38. Online Opinions is also the only one, if you can see down the bottom, is the only one we can tell what proportion of members is actually active on the list. So there are a few questions that are left out there doing this, but we didn't talk to a single real person. We only looked at archived stuff. And so no interview or effect until now, Graham. Okay, so I'm big on descriptive statistics. The descriptive statistics tell us, if we think about the content of the lists, once we've fed the messages through our coding frame, it tells us something on our top 3 issues. On socialisation, mobilisation and aggregation, we learn a couple of things. First, this slide shows us that the lists are very, very active in terms of political socialisation. By and far, the most messages that travel along the list are about politics. Okay, that's not surprising, but if we look at the statistics down the bottom, kind of call to arms, invite action style messages, so messages that say, let's go out and picket, lobby, stand around, do something. These are not very common messages, and on Online Opinions, for example, only 0.74 of all the messages that we surveyed actually has some sort of, well, let's do something. And when we unpack those kind of figures, what they're often asking us to do is really kind of, nothing. Let's go out and send somebody an email, rather than let's go out and invade Poland, for example. So the lists themselves are big on political socialisation. So in a sense, what they do show us is that these lists are, in a sense, kind of the Habermasian coffee houses where all these people are gathered around and they're talking about politics. What it's safe to say, however, is when we actually look at what they're talking about, so these kind of bullet pointed figures down the bottom, there is a very strong relationship between the list content and current event style content. In terms of the two supported lists, online opinions and political lobby, that's not too surprising. They both have associated content that is driven around current affairs and current events. So online opinions, for example, has every week lots and lots of articles, opinion pieces on current political issues, be they in the Age or the Australian, or things that people are trying to get up into public discourse. And so the list itself reflects the focus. Same with political lobby, but even with regards to Australian politics, it's still pretty high up there, that people come onto the lists and they talk about issues and events. So these lists really are the kind of taxi cab style conversational space. People are talking about issues and events that are going on right now. So as you look at the list, you can really track back and see how during the peak of the refugee debate, people are really talking about refugees. During the peak of the Tampa crisis, they're talking about the role of the security agencies and the like. Now, in a sense, that could be constructed in a normative way, and I don't think we need to get into it to a great deal of extent. But what it does show us is that as political socialisation locations, that these lists tend to be rather disjointed in the way in which information occurs. People start talking about whatever's in the paper, in online opinions, coming out through the political lobby portal, and it's driven by the media priority of the day. So as those issues tend to shift around, people's discussion shifts around. Okay, this is a broad generalisation, of course. But what it shows us is if we're looking to political email lists and the internet in general terms to be a new kind of source where we can all really bone up on politics, get a really good understanding of issues and processes and personalities, we're actually learning in a very fragmented and possibly disjointed way. That may be a good thing in terms of that's going to shift us from surface to deep learning in some cases, when you really challenge people by moving issues around. And we all know, well, those of us who are lecturers know that that can be a very effective way of teaching. But what it means is there's no real structured education kind of thing. And there are some exceptions, of course. Online opinions, for example, has had periods of time when there's been long, structured discussions about economic theory, for example. And we can see some of that in the actual paper itself, in the way in which a lot of the messages, particularly in online opinions, are heavily referenced with sources of authority that justify the discussion. Okay, including sometimes people are quoting books that people should go out and read. Okay. However, as I've already identified, these lists are not places where people come to be politically active, to actually move beyond the list itself to achieve political outcomes. And possibly the reason behind this, and this is rather sketchy data, without having surveyed the participants, which is impossible because of the longitudinal aspect to it, what we see is when we look and try and interpret what people say about their political ideology, I use the term very loosely, and if Rachel Gibson was here, she would say, hey, didn't you really criticise the Australian electoral study for the left-right kind of continuum? If we look at the way people identify themselves in political ideological terms, we see that these lists are not at all sources of political aggregation. Okay? If we look at the lists themselves, online opinions, when people actually identify themselves in kind of ideological terms, and there's only 20% of list members who've actually done that, what we see is that, you know, there's some left, there's some centre, there's some right. So in a sense, people are coming together for a good political discussion and debate, but they're not coming together like they used to in political parties because they all have some sort of core belief and then they can turn that into mobilisation. So if we're looking to the internet to be the replacement for parties that are on the wane, possibly, if you believe the literature, but are certainly becoming less representative, less like mass parties than they used to be, these are not it. Okay? Socialisation, yes. Mobilisation and aggregation, no. Let's unpack that a bit more, because I want to go back and stick the knife into Pippa Norris again. Why not? She's not here. In that, Pippa Norris said, okay, what have we got going on? Are young people not participating because they're doing other things? If we look at the list, you could say, hey, the internet's where young people are. What we find, and although we don't really know, but I'm interpreting statistics very loosely here and just going with it, what we find is that people on this list, unsurprisingly perhaps, they're classic joiners. When we analyse what they say, we identify that about 51% of the people on online opinions are a member of one of these other organisations in their society. Now, any of you who have got really big into the kind of Putnam-esque literature will know that we're not joining anymore. We're not certainly joining faith organisations or parties or whatever. These people happen to be joiners. And so that says to me, they're actually not the young people. The young people aren't here. These are actually the old people, the people who are still in parties themselves. So we haven't located in that normative construction the alternative site where political activity is occurring, that the young people have gone off. So I say to Pippa, what's going on? What's going on? Shouldn't this be the location of cause-based activism? How do I go for time? I'm fine. In addition, and now I start to lead into the social networking theory that I've used, I was wondering, well, maybe people just want to come online, they want to have a chat, and it's a social kind of thing. And there's been a lot of discussion going back to Donath or the stories of the well, that was by Voices from the Well, what's his name? Thank you. A fair amount of discussion about email lists and their function socially, in that people can express themselves in a way it's not face-to-face and things like that. When we analyse the list content here, we find incredibly limited amount of socialising activity, non-political discussion about things. Okay? Now, one of the stats I don't have up is that the list, they're quite angry lists. People often are having arguments, but they're not as offensive as often lists are assumed to be. But people are not coming on these lists to chat. They're coming on really to talk about politics. There's a real kind of functional designation to these lists. So, now we come to the sociograms, and it all starts to go a bit downhill from here. When I realised I had access to a very interesting data set, the way in which people respond to other people using the to and from fields, I said, what I have here, and this is totally to dehumanise people, I have edges and nodes. I can take that data and I can crunch it, and I can look at the way people respond to each other online. Okay? And I can use that data using the basic kind of networking theory, and I can construct social network diagrams here. And this is the one which people communicate to each other on the Australian politics line. I've taken that data, and what I've done is I've looked by colour-coding it into factions, okay, to see if there are centres of gravity. And what we see as we look through the list, here's the Australian politics sociogram, here's the political lobby sociogram, see the red and the blue, the red and the blue. Here's the online opinion sociogram. When I reduce it down, what we have is, at some point in time, there is a critical mass that happens. The political lobby and Australian politics list analysed, they weren't really community online. They're actually two distinct conversations that happen to be happening at the same time using one piece of technology. We cannot identify them as a community. On the other hand, online opinions, and we've stepped forward, so I've pulled out heaps of data out of this. When we take out, and drop back to the most busy people, and you see I've identified all these people, right? Get stuck in. Oh, names. There are names. Well, when we take out the data, what we see is actually there are only a few people who are kind of outliers here. And what we have is actually a community of people engaged in a discussion where they talk to each other a lot. And there isn't that much distance between people. A relatively dense sociogram emerged. So what we can say is, in summary, and I like to move through because I want to kind of gut my methodology a little bit, is that what we have is, yes, we have an interesting, vibrant source of political socialisation online in these lists. There is very active and vigorous debate Okay? But it appears that the moderated lists, which is online opinion in this case, is less prone to abusive conversation. Still can have argumentative messages, lots of argumentative message, but less kind of abusive messages to people aimed at other people on the lists. What we have is definitely, crudely, a public sphere in the kind of political science concept. I don't know if it's a park or a garden or a subway, but it's a public sphere in that people are coming online to talk about public sphere type things, but we don't have, in terms of the list themselves, active citizenry, but they are active citizens. The list is not an expression of that. However, and here's the problem. Whoa. Definitely, these people tend to be, I believe, and there's a methodological problem that needs to be proven, they are older people. These are not where the young people are at. We know that because of the high proportion of memberships, but also because of the incredibly low number of people who identify themselves as post-materialist in their ideology. Okay? If there were young people there, we would see people not fitting in the left-right spectrum. Okay? And we don't see that. However, I think this is where I need to add a new bullet point here, which is obviously ethical problems. Okay, right? However, there are other problems as well as ethics. First of all is obviously the choice of lists. Okay? I took a conservative list set. I wasn't looking at instant messaging. I wasn't looking at people chatting through real-time gaming online. I was looking at very, very conventional, almost old-fashioned technologies. Is there a relationship there between, that's where the young people are at. I see Mary Griffiths ready to have a go too. Get into it. But more than that, a number of things. In getting access to all that lovely, lovely longitudinal data, which you can only get through these archived lists, I have problems. I can't go back and survey these people. I'm not really sure whether my assumptions are right about them being older. Also, because I've used a conventional social networking approach, I'm afraid my sociograms might be wrong. What I get is I don't include people who post but get no response. Now, the assumption would be that if people post and get no response, there's nothing happening there, right? And then you'd say, well, it doesn't matter that because the sociological networking approach relies on ties, people communicating, reciprocated ties, that's not a problem. Someone comes into a room and says, hey, what do you guys think about AFL? No one responds. They're not part of the core clique. But in excluding those nodes, I wonder if we're not getting something about a conversation that happens online that's different to a conversation in a room. And this is where obviously the paradigm of the public sphere, the coffee house, the people walking into rooms sort of thing, is overlaid across a technology that is doing something different. If somebody comes onto a list and says something that everyone really agrees with, do they have to respond? And if they don't respond, is that the same as when people don't respond to a spoken conversation? So I wonder if paradigmatically the social networking approach I've taken is wrong. And so I'm a bit cautious about using that. Also, in terms of the way in which I've identified cliques and subgroups, the red and the blue, is that meaningful in this context? In terms of social networking theory, a clique is usually a group that's over there. They are separate in some way. But a clique online, everyone gets each other's messages. So is it meaningful that these groups are kept separate in my sociogram? So I've got methodological concerns. That's it.
Well, over to you for comments, questions, discussions to Rose and or Pete.
I really enjoyed that. In terms of the public sphere theory, I'm interested in, this is something that often people do when they study groups online. They choose what would be obviously explicitly political site. And then the problem there. When Habermas looks at the public sphere, he doesn't talk about spaces that existed that actually had political above them. And I think that they get sort of science and communication science to look at, like these sites actually are framed as political.
Yep.
But then if you look at political studies people, they might say, well, it's just as political, more political. If you go to a site that is a team site that's discussing, I don't know,
sure,
home life or something. So it's how political is framed and active citizenry is framed, which actually might actually determine the results. So it might be right back to the beginning in terms of the framework, because that could then...
Well, it's not the framework, it's the sampling approach that's taken and the construction list. I mean, you're absolutely right.
Well, it could be the understanding of politics in the first place, that a lot of, when people are talking about e-governance and how do we link up citizenry again, the whole conception of what is citizenry and what is politics could be, questioned.
Well, yeah, but I mean, that's what's politics for me? Politics is an expression of power. Power happens in every interaction you have. So, yeah, I agree, and I think that's kind of interesting. I think that is a devastating critique, and I think it works. And I totally agree, and I totally think you're right. When I kind of point out a few people around the room who say it's happening in other places, absolutely, I agree. When we take our methodology out there to look at those kind of things, we'd find that the paradigm of a very conventional content analysis, and I don't have the coding frame, but it was a very conventional coding frame, which you could run through a lot of messages, and this is the point, you see, would obviously fall apart instantly when we just look at every kind of list and say, well, where's the political content there? Because the coding frame, which you can then get a team of coders and have a high intercoder reliability test on, is not going to work. And so you instantly have to then discard that approach. The advantage of that approach is obviously the amount of material you can filter through. The disadvantage is you cap down, I think. And certainly I think the interesting thing to go forward is that there's been some interesting applications of social networking to, say, instant messaging and the like that have been created on the fly, like feeding out stuff. But the actual content analysis, it requires human brains to sit there, to read the messages, to code it, and there's no way around that sort of thing. Obviously, if we went into kind of a post-structuralist discourse approach, the entire kind of thing is a different methodology, and it would get at that. Yeah. But in terms of, and when I started out, I said I'm taking a very kind of constrained construction here, and I'm pretending to be a political scientist, in that you go to those lists that self-kind of report because you're looking for political mobilisation. If we're just looking for politics, yeah, we totally want to discard that.
The political mobilisation happen through, like social movements, feminist movement, right?
Yeah.
The way that feminist movement has changed society. It didn't happen sort of in frameworks and purely through Parliament. I mean, it's a social, cultural.
Yeah, and we're not talking about Parliament here at all. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I think the thing is, and this is the constraint. Again, we're looking for a mass kind of thing. So yeah, those things spun out into general political concerns, but they often started with the narrow focus. Yeah, I think it's an unresolvable problem, like methodologically, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
I also have a question for Peter. You mentioned because you're working with longitudinal data that you feel that you won't be able to survey any of the participants for these mailing lists. I'm wondering why you feel that. Is it because you won't be able to locate these people because they may no longer be active participants in the mailing list, or their email address may be invalid, or is it a question that you're worried about the use of their active certificates, that they're going to have to recall what their attitudes were back when they were active participants?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. One, and this is more a suspicion than anything else, the average Australian family moves once every 7 years. But the unaverage Australian family moves a lot more than that. And so, I think the same thing is with email addresses. Once you go back a few years, you get people who are freakishly static. Like academics with tenure. There's like the academics with tenure, they're freakishly static people. Yeah, and so it's partly methodological, but also the question of memory, but also then the interviewer effect. And theoretically, until Graham Young sat in this room, we could come back and have another look at it in a few years. But now Graham's seen it, he's going to run out and change his behaviour all over the place. Because he saw where he sat in the network. And he went, oh, it's a kind of self-supporting network. I've got to be more active on the list, and he'll change his behaviour. So there's those kind of features, I think.
Up back.
Yeah, I think we haven't taken it that far, and I think because it's a pilot methodology, and I'm unsatisfied with the social networking approach. So rather than kind of, you know, pig's ear, what's it? Silk purse out of a sow's ear kind of thing. Yeah, they seem to have the same characteristics as the other messages, but for some reason they don't kind of happen, sort of thing. And they're not outliers by nature. In fact, to some extent, outliers are more likely to get picked up because they say something strange or offensive or whatever, sort of thing. Yeah, so there's no real pattern to it as far as I can tell. Certainly I think the coding frame approach obviously doesn't give you the subtlety to really get into what it is about it. But some of them are simply, hi guys, so I'm here, what's going on, sort of thing. Yeah, no, that's right. And what we've got to do is obviously take the author characteristic data and put it back onto the network data. But I don't think we should do that unless we're more confident that the network data actually works, if you know what I mean. And I'm not sure that that's the case at all. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, Rose probably wants to come in and gut me, but I think I'd say this. I really didn't think about it too much until I sat down and heard Rose speak. And until I heard Rose speak, I would have said these people are engaged in discussion on a public list, and it's public. On the other hand, the list is an archived site of a listserv software. For most of those people, they're not interacting with each other through the website. Some of them are, because it's got two interfaces. A lot of them are doing it through their email clients. Email clients might be seen in a more private and personal light. Now, I haven't gone in my paper and said, this person in this node has these characteristics. So Rose might take it easy on me, or, oh no, okay, no, has these characteristics. But certainly, now that I've heard Rose's paper, I certainly wouldn't want to go back and say, here is this node, I'll just give you a few rundowns on their average whatever, where they sit politically, da-da-da-da-da, because they might be simply having a discussion with a few dozen friends through their email client. And a good example, and this is where I do definitely need to go back and edit my paper. In my paper, I identify a person who, just in a footnote sort of thing, who actually does attract social discussion. But that person actually is a self-reported brain injury individual on a list who some people stick the knife into and other people say, hey, leave them alone. And now I think, shit, I'm not sure, even if I ask for informed consent, that this person's up to it, I've got to go and take that name out of there, sort of thing. However, even if I refer to that, the list is still public. One other thing, however, if I can just, the archive site does allow you to go back and delete your own messages. And there were only about 3 messages that had been deleted in the sample. That partly is a response, but not everyone has the savvy to go back and do that. Do you know what I'm saying? So I appreciated that. I think you were implying that there's public and private, it's a continuum. For some people, definitely they perceive themselves in the public arena, and some people who participated in some of the lists were very public figures. Other people, I think, would have seen themselves as just having a private conversation with a few friends through their email client, which is a private mode of conversation. And certainly, I think we've all sent email at times, not really remembering. And the other thing is, with email, once or twice on the list, someone might have sent a private correspondence to someone, usually in the context of a dispute, which then that person outed onto the list. And that's a big issue. Now, I didn't make reference to that in my paper, but if I had, then I think Rose would be informing some authority figure. No. Yeah.
No, we don't do that to young academics. Peter's paper actually raises a lot of the paradoxes, and there's no simple answers to them. in terms of publicly and archived data, probably one of the sort of basic things I would think about would be how to anonymise or depersonalise, give people codes, something like that, because of the possibility of being able to be identified. Now, in the email discussion list, it's actually really interesting. Peter's already alluded to the fact that there's different groups of people in there. One of the things that we consider in sort of ethical circles is that if someone's a public figure, like a member of parliament, an employee of a large public or private organisation, you go and interview them or collect information from them, they're speaking to you often from their organisational voice, not necessarily their personal voice. But if you go and interview union representatives, employers, and the employers want to know what the union representatives said, that introduces another power dynamic or basis to it. So quite often when we looked at research protocols, if people were members of parliament in official designations or positions, there's an assumption there that they will be able to make distinctions about what they want to say publicly and what they might say privately. But what I was trying to point out is that you can't always assume in the one-to-one email discussions and even in public postings that people are always clearly have it in mind that they want it to go somewhere else in a public way. So for some people it's very public, and for some people it might be a very sort of like, personal sort of thing. The suggestions are the same as with any sort of data, and that is if you are going to cite someone or quote someone, you give them a pseudonym or you give them the opportunity to be de-identified. And a lot of data is used that's de-identified, and that solves the problem. So if there's very, very particular email addresses, and Peter's quite right, this is one of the technical flaws of the internet, and I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, but I was reading them the day before I came down. The number of people who change their email addresses in Australia within 6 months are phenomenal, so that actually getting back to people later to ask consent is just technically impossible, because they're no longer online. And it's even more problematic in America, which has a much, much higher usage of the internet than in Australia. So it's more a case of, if we can try and think about some of the issues beforehand, but then studies evolve, research questions evolve, and it's not always possible to do that. So,
thanks, Rose. There's someone else who I'd like to deal into this particular conversation, and that's Graham Young, whose brainchild was online opinions. What's your response, Graham?
I don't see any ethical issues. I missed your speech, so I might be speaking completely out of ignorance. But I see the paradigm of the open forum as being like an open meeting like this. And if I was at a political party convention, I got up and I made a speech, which is essentially what we do when we post, I wouldn't have a problem with the press reporting on that. I wouldn't have a problem with journalists saying, well, X, Y, and Z was standing in a corner plotting, or we saw them over. And I think the other participants would probably see it in a similar way. We do occasionally have arguments on the web, on the site rather, about fair use issues to do with copying whole slabs of text, say, from a newspaper. Because I take the point of view that we're publishing. No matter how small the group is that's involved in it, we are publishing, we're making that information available to a larger audience. And therefore we have to be aware of not just fair use of copyright, but defamation issues as well. So we've had discussions about that as well as that, and some of the moderation that I've exercised has been to actually take down material that has appeared to me to be defamatory, or at least run a risk on. I'm fascinated by what Peter's done. It's something that in terms of how we're trying to develop the overall site, we actually see as being part of the benefit that we're giving to the people who are using the site. We do some surveying of the online opinion site where we do de-identify people, because that's part of the deal. We say, all right, we're going to do a focus group, but we guarantee that you're going to be anonymous. And in that situation, they're behaving in an entirely different way from someone who's going to a group which is archived, which can be publicly accessed. So I don't have a problem with that, and I don't have a problem with being on the little map there. And I think the other people on the group will be fascinated and probably have a sort of sense of pride and probably increased importance that an academic has gone to the trouble to study what we've been talking about. and it might make someone watch the manners a little bit better in the future too. Make the moderator's job easier.
Can I just comment on that briefly? What you've just said, Graham, is very typical of what people have discovered in the polarities of opinions in discussion lists. Hodgkinson joined a list and lurked for a while and decided not to disclose that, I think it's a he or she, can't remember, was a researcher. But when they went back to write up their data, it was qualitative research, they actually decided if they were going to quote somebody and they'd actually go back to the email address that they had and try and contact them and say, is it okay, because it's going to be out there in a different form of public arena. But what you said about there's a moderator going in and making sure there's no defamation there's copyright issues adhered to, all that sort of stuff, that's broadly now within the whole ethical parameters in terms of you're doing that as a moderator. And for a novice researcher, sometimes lots of stuff gets pinched and plagiarised and downloaded off the internet and dumped onto those sorts of lists. So cutting and splicing that stuff, you really need to be astute in terms of who it's attributed to, because you can be cutting and splicing stuff that actually is third or fifth or sixth person and that sort of thing. So I guess with archive material, we're catching up with what has already happened with human behaviour. And there's not much point, I think, personally, doing things retrospective. Somebody came up with a suggestion at the back of, in future, maybe for people who have those sorts of sites, that there's some sort of disclaimer up there that this is definitely seen by the people who set it up as public. Everything you post on is public, and it can be used by anyone. Because in Hodgkinson's study, what she found was that when she disclosed she was a researcher, for about 2 weeks there was this inflamed discussion between the people who said, of course it's public, and the other people who took the opposite view. And then they came together and said, well, research isn't such a bad thing. In fact, we're glad you're exploring this issue. But it gave them the opinion, gave everyone on their list to have their 2 bobs worth. And it was actually quite interesting because they came out in favour of her using it, but they wanted to have a bit of discussion. They wanted to have the control over saying yes or no. But
when we, sorry, just to kind of throw in there, wouldn't we, I think a couple of things. One's the Hawthorne effect issue, which you're going to have, and obviously the different, lab of and casual versus guarded speech. So, although we kind of, we've gone away from covert kind of research, there was a reason why we did it in the first place, and maybe we're not spying on people having gay sex in toilets anymore like we used to. I kind of miss those days though, but certainly we do still see the value of people not really watching what they say. And part of the interesting thing I wanted to know about online opinions and political lobby and those is just how goddamn rude they were to each other. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And because that's a sort of power in politics too.
But it's interesting about the Hawthorne effect is the Hawthorne effect diminishes. So often when you're doing face-to-face stuff, people are really aware of being interviewed for a short period of time, and then they lapse back into their normal sort of behaviour.
Yeah, but that's the problem with your disclaimers as well.
There's no, as I said, in terms of the literature that's been emerging, there's only tentative suggestions at the moment. There's no concrete examples that say someone who was in my position on an ethics committee necessarily. We took what I call the deontological approach, and that was decided on a case-by-case basis rather than having any generic rules, because it just doesn't work that way.
Now,
You've been provoked.
yes.
Oh,
Too nice.
try to be.
Can I just make the notion of putting disclaimers up on this important, I guess hypothetical that as a tool would work. I mean, people see that the very first time they sign along with certain reservations. It's a bit like if you software, you want to use the software, you have to say yes. Nobody ever reads what it says. I don't know anybody that's actually read one of those information licenses signed with yes, of course. But nobody actually reads the disclaimer. And then the next thing is, it depends on actually the flow of the discussion as to whether or not you're actually going to be a public or a private participant. 4 o'clock in the morning when there's only one other person on the list, you know that you're in effect having a private discussion. And you don't think about the fact that the thing is actually being recorded and becomes a database that you can later review. So I guess disclaimers, I don't see disclaimers working at all. And it all comes down to the intent at the time of the author writing the message.
I was just trying to think of what a disclaimer might be, you know. This is a coffee house, not a private dinner party.
We've actually used one on a site which is creative that says that this is a public forum and anything you post on it might be used for reporting or research purposes.
Yeah. I think I'd like to come back at your comments. It's very, very interesting. It's not so much an ethical question. Like as I was involved with ethics institutionally for about 6 years, what was happening more was it was becoming more a legal thing. Privacy laws, copyright laws, changes of perceptions about that. And where Graham is sort of toying and thinking about as a moderator, taking various sorts of precautions, managing risk and all that sort of Beckian stuff. And what you've just said, I think actually preempts the next phase. And that is, it's already happening with Europe because the European Union have very strict data privacy laws. People are being sued for what they put on public lists. People, for all sorts of different reasons. There's copyright suits, there's all sorts of commercial sort of suits about art, images and that sort of stuff, but also words. So researchers who get involved in that can inadvertently get involved in a minefield of legalities that have nothing to do with ethics and nothing to do with their research.
Bridge.
That's right.
Can I just add one thing? I think there's a lot of confusion with people using the net as to what it is they think they're doing. I think some people are inappropriately using a conversational metaphor, when in fact you really are publishing. And I think there's an education need at schools, basically. Anyone who puts a website up as a publisher and they don't really understand that they are. Bloggers are publishers, and some of the things that people put on their blogs, and, you know, someone's going to get themselves in serious trouble. I think if you actually sort out what it is you're doing, some of these issues don't arise because people then will be clear that, you know, just if I put a letter in the paper, I know that people are going to read it. If I put a letter on an archive, on a site that's archived, I know that people are going to read it and we're going to do what they want with it. You know, whether it's flipping it out and putting it somewhere or using the survey or whatever. So, you know, I think there's academics and others have really got to start talking to their students about what it is that they're doing. And it solves a lot of the problems.
Well, in part that's about mindfulness, and it is with regret that I need to declare this forum closed. It's 3:05. We've had some very lively issues here. Thanks for great presentations and also your questions. So a vote of thanks to Rose and to
Have you got Pippa's nicest stuff in your paper that's going to be published?
Yes, I think it
Because
was actually...
post-materialist arguments, explaining on paper, discussions a bit thin myself.
Well,
I don't know how much data there is to prove that.
Depends how much, I mean, and the person you really need to talk to about that is Rachel Gibson. It depends how much you believe the Australian electoral study, which she says, you know, it's not too bad. And I say, it's got incredibly large numbers of data elements and incredibly small sample set, 18 million people are supposed to be generalising about. So if you believe the data, then yeah, young people are much more post-materialist. And if you don't find post-materialist on your thing, you probably don't have young people. If you don't believe the data, but if you don't believe that data, then...
I think in relation to your list, you don't have young people.
I don't.
Some and some aren't.
Yeah, well, some and some, of course. But I mean, yeah, I knew you were going to...
I just didn't get a chance to answer the question.
Why the starting point of young people generational change? I just didn't get that, and also the assumptions that it's people on the group. Like some will be young people, just some people.
Yeah, and some
yeah. Turned on by computer stuff.
Yeah, but if you ever go to a formal party congress now in Australia, like the UK, you look at where are the young people? There were a few.
Where are all the people?
Yeah, but there were.
Still such a tiny proportion of people who want to join parties.
Oh yeah, no, there always were. I mean, party membership, except for the National Party, has remained basically. I mean, major effective parties has remained static over time, which as the population's gone up, means the proportion has gone down. I was using it well, not because I buy it, but it was a good kind of point of departure. Well, it seemed like a good idea when I write the abstract. And then when I came to write the paper a couple of weeks ago, I couldn't remember exactly what, but it seemed like a good reason. Not that I buy the fundamentally functionalist construction, but political scientists like that. And so I said, let's play the game of being a political scientist. So I saw you there, and I went, ah! And then I looked over and there was Mary Griffiths, and I went, oh no! Yeah, I know, yeah. I mean, to be honest, the methodology was an interesting pilot. Didn't really hit home for me, and I'm not sure I buy it exactly. So that's my caveat.
Will you keep going with it?
I don't know. I'm not sure it works. I mean, like Roger Ackland, I don't know if you
I've
thought.
never seen that network.
Oh,
You
okay.
just plug that into a computer and it doesn't work.
No, it's very convoluted. Well, it's a software package, and essentially you create a matrix, and see, on one side is John, Mary, Bob, John, Mary, Bob, because John talks to John, and it's a reciprocal type thing.
So you have to code it all in.
Yeah, you code it, and then you put it in a matrix. So, yeah, and then you get the software, and it's got really lousy, a really lousy manual, and you try and work out the manual, and you get a thing, you say, does that work, and you're not really sure. And there's a, you know, it comes from the mathematical end of sociology.
Well, I went to
Yeah, and I mean,
Did you go to their paper yesterday? On the party?
no, I read their paper, and
How does that work?
well, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. They're saying, do these people link to these people? Node, tie. Exactly the same approach. They're using a slightly different package which he's developed. I'm using a standard off the shelf. Same approach. It assumes that if two nodes have a tie, there's some sort of connection and relationship. So you and I, we're all surveyed in this room. I say I'm your friend, you say you're my friend, we have a strong tie. You say you're her friend, but she doesn't say it's a weaker tie. You've got no connection with Bruce, there's no tie. And then we find that this is a little click here and there's a little click here, and we infer something. And you can also do lots and lots of complex mathematical stuff about densities and distances and stuff like that. But once I produced the thing, and I said, well, where are these other people? Well, they don't appear. I said, well, I don't think we should go too far, because I use multivariate clustering for my PhD, which creates dendrograms, and it's got Euclidean distances and things like that. And once again, I said, well, you can only go fast. So I've got a different sort. But the thing is, once you feed it through the whiz bang and you get the zippy doodah, that can really reify something that may be like bullshit. And so when the shit meter goes, I stop, rather than some people go, well, this is that, because no one's gonna tweet. Pretty pictures. You got a concern? Hey, look! Sort of thing. I mean, I don't mind.
I just want to say I'm Janet Stanley. I write on some of the stuff you've done before, or similar, related to internet with pornography, adult industry, child.
You know Carolyn Penfold?
No.
There's another writer on that area. Yeah, I used to be the big porn guy.
So you moved from that, or you still?
I still have an interest in that regulatory stuff, but nothing as much has been. Well, as a kind of top-down guide, nothing much has been happening in the federal government area, except that the report they were supposed to table before Parliament is being. What happens to that?
Okay, I'm at the Brotherhood with Paul.
Oh, okay.
Right. And so I might come and have lunch with you or something and chat about what we're doing. And,
yes, that would be good.
This package of my life isn't actually with Paul's Brotherhood. It was with the Australian Institute of Family Studies. But I'm continuing on myself anyway.
Okay. So you saw my thesis or some of my articles or something?
I've used a lot of your our industry stuff and
that was
stuff
it's not really academic publishing.
Internet service providers in an article I've just written, but it's not published yet.
Okay. Well.
Use all this stuff, I like it.
Okay. Yeah. Did you see my submission to the inquiry? It's on the.
The Senate inquiry.
No, the recent one.
Yeah. Senate inquiry
Well,
into.
No, it's not Senate inquiry. No.
You thought you put that in there.
No, I submitted to the New South Wales inquiry. I was studying the Senate inquiry, so I didn't submit to those because I was just being a researcher. No, I put a submission into the departmental review. Sorry, the review. And
no, I didn't do that.
well, if you look at that submission, you see I've got some not particularly scientific data in there about small ISPs and their responses to the regulatory regime, which is very interesting. Yeah, and that's why the global IAs I talked to you.
Yeah. I'm interested in pursuing further what we should be doing to regulate ISPs.
Yeah, no, well, can we talk about that? I'm still interested in that work and I still can talk about it, but I haven't published anything new on that because nothing in Australia has happened, particularly since. Yes. Okay, right. Yeah, well, no, we'll definitely have a discussion. Yes. Good to meet you. Good. Hey, Bruce.
Good talk. I came in after you started.
Oh.
You're very good. You should be doing this, you know. This isn't me.
No.
I guess you can't say your own conscience. But,
Well, I remember.